If our soils are lacking in calcium or magnesium, how do we overcome this? Well, we can overcome this with fertilizers. So let's talk specifically about some of these fertilizers. Now, oftentimes we don't add calcium and or magnesium as a fertilizer. We oftentimes add calcium and or magnesium to raise soil pH as a liming source. But if you want to think of some of these compounds or mineral phases as calcium fertilizers or magnesium fertilizers, we're going to talk about those in this video. So common calcium fertilizers include calcium carbonate. This would be used for liming. Contains 40% calcium. That's based on the molecular weight of calcium as a function of the molecular weight of calcium carbonate. Okay. Calcium has a molecular weight of 40 and calcium carbonate has a molecular weight of 100. 40 divided by 100, and then if you put that on a percentage basis and multiply by 100 equals 40. That's where that value comes from. And that's where these other percentages or values come from on this slide. You could use calcium sulfate to supply calcium needs. Calcium sulfate is not a liming source. We learned about that in the liming unit or when we discussed acidity and alkalinity in soils, but it will add calcium to a soil. You could add triple superphosphate. This is a phosphorus fertilizer that contains calcium. This is not a liming source. But more often than not, calcium sources are applied for other reasons. For example, and we just mentioned some of these, we use calcium sources to increase pH and reduce exchangeable acidity, right? That's number one in the list above. That's calcium carbonate, CaCO3. We add a calcium source to reduce sodium toxicity, especially in sodic soils. And we use calcium sulfate or calcium SO4. The SO4 is actually converted to sulfuric acid to help reduce pH that you find in sodic soils. And the calcium is added to kick sodium off of cation exchange sites in sodic soils. Or we add calcium sources to increase phosphorus availability. For example, triple superphosphate. So the big note at the bottom of this slide is that these are often applied as calcium. These are often not applied as calcium fertilizers. More often as a liming benefit, and in some instances, we add calcium sources to reduce sodium toxicity. We would find these issues in areas that are semi-arid to arid or to increase phosphorus availability. What about magnesium fertilizers? Magnesium fertilizers are primarily comprised of three different types of fertilizers. Dolomitic limestone, so liming materials that contain calcium and magnesium. So calcium, magnesium carbonate. The content of magnesium varies somewhere between 3 and 12%, and that's based on impurities in the source of dolomite. You can add magnesium sulfate or Epsom salt, or you could add sulpomag. And we talked about sulpomag if you go back to the videos that focused on fertilizers in the potassium unit, right? And so another big note, and I'll end with this, that dolomitic lime is used for low pH soils, while those other sources are used for high pH soils if necessary. Most of our soils that are high in pH across the globe typically don't need magnesium. But if they do, and you need to lower the pH, the sulfate in either point number 2 or 3 above, the sulfate actually can react through microorganisms in water to create sulfuric acid and help to eventually lower the pH.